Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 4 of our CEO series. And tonight I have with me the leadership team from Hazel Health, and we'll be talking about communicating business needs with clinical leadership. So here's our agenda. We'll do some introductions. We'll hear about Hazel and the history, and then we'll talk about fostering transparency and communication between business and clinical. And then we'll open it up for some questions. So I'll let my guests introduce themselves. Let's start with the CEO of Hazel Health.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Nice to meet everyone. My name is Josh Golomb. I'm Hazel's CEO, and I'll give a little of the Hazel story in a minute, but by way of background, so the first 5 years of my career was in the nonprofit sector. So I worked in schools for a few years and was doing inner-city economic development work for a few years, and then shifted gears. And I've spent the last 20 years in healthcare. So Hazel's the third healthcare company I've been able to lead, and excited to talk to you guys today. Ebonie, I'll turn it to you.
Sure. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Jacqueline. Good evening, everyone. I am Ebonie Barnes. I am the current director of Hazel's nationwide mental health program. I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I'm licensed in a couple of states, and just, prior to coming to Hazel, I was with some other organizations also in the telehealth space. So I've kind of been in leadership for telehealth, mental health telehealth organizations and substance abuse organizations for going on about 8 years now. I was super excited to stumble upon and learn so much about Hazel and have the opportunity to join this team in particular, just growing our footprint across the nation. It's been really, really exciting, and I'm looking forward to talking more with you all this evening.
All right. Thanks so much. All right, Josh, we'll turn it over to you again. Tell us a little bit about Hazel.
Yeah, and so first, what Hazel is, so we partner with school districts, and we essentially turn schools into virtual care delivery sites so that kids can get access to both doctors and also therapists right while they're at school or at home. But we typically start at the school site where, because we believe that's a great way to drive access for all kids. The quick story, when we often at Hazel will tell kind of our own personal why. And so for me, the Hazel story, so it actually starts a long time ago. So my grandparents immigrated over into the US in the early 1940s from Mexico. And so they came across the border. My grandparents were undocumented. They only spoke Spanish. And my grandmother, who just passed away 3 years ago, an amazing woman, they had 13 kids. 9 of whom survived. And my grandfather, right, literally when he was about the age I am right now, and they had 9 kids, he was a painter. He was painting one of someone's garage, and he has a heart attack. And ambulance comes to pick up my grandfather and then to take him to the closest hospital. But unfortunately, the first hospital they go to won't see him because he has the equivalent of what was Medicaid at the time. And so, and they only would take him if he had commercial insurance. And so they reroute him, and in the process of rerouting, he goes into a coma and passes away. And so my grandmother then raised her 9 kids. My mom was number 2 in a 2-bedroom apartment in Southern California, not speaking the language. And for our family, the narrative that got passed down for generations has been that my grandfather passed away because of lack of healthcare access. I didn't use those exact words, but the idea being that kind of the healthcare system wasn't built for him. And in our family, my family is phenomenal. There's so many wonderful things that I've taken away from this family, but there's also a lot of generational trauma that's come through of things that have through our family, and a lot of that has given a lot of our, my wonderful cousins and folks strength, and it's also caused challenges. My older sister today is an LCSW, and so we've both taken sort of different paths. Like, how do you find a way to sort of go and give back from what we've both the wonderful things we've taken and the things we want to change? And so for me, Hazel, then fast forward, now I'm an adult and I'm working in healthcare. Most of my adult career was working for adults and seniors, trying to help with healthcare access, folks who look like my grandparents. And then I had my own 3 kids. And so I have 3 sons. I have a senior in high school and 2 freshmen. And my senior, who just got into his first college a couple of weeks ago, my wife and I, when he was at 15 months old, we found out that he was born deaf. And so we both have recessive gene for deafness in our family. We didn't know. And we had to now navigate the healthcare system as parents. And it was an incredibly humbling experience for us because even though I worked in healthcare, I needed a ton of great doctors, we had good insurance. We had to now try to navigate this as parents. And doctors we met all the clinicians we met along the way were phenomenal. But it was so hard to navigate the healthcare system. And so many of the parents we met through that process didn't have those same advantages that we had. And so the idea for me, the story of coming to Hazel is about this idea of how do you create, if you really want to transform kind of care and access for everyone, could you go and do that first and foremost for kids and for parents? And could you build a model from the get-go that was really meant for everyone, that wasn't built around folks who just have a certain insurance, who can speak English as a native language? What would that look like? And so that's why, for us, schools have been the natural starting point to say, that is the one place in our country where there is universal access to care. And there's already great providers, both school nurses, school counselors, and therapists that operate there. And can we help make them more successful? So that's the story on how we got here. And or for my story, I should say, at least. And then as Jacqueline and I were talking about, like, what might be helpful for you, I said, I worked a long time ago in the nonprofit world. And part of why I went into for-profit healthcare is because I always loved the experience. And I've met some amazing people on the nonprofit side. And I think one of the biggest things I struggled with is, how do you scale something that works so great locally? And how do you think about scaling that nationally? And that's where the idea of, for me, being able to operate in a different setting creates a different way to help and engage with more folks. But there's also a lot of challenges. And as Jacqueline and Ebonie and I talked, what I thought might be helpful was to share a few things, like from a CEO perspective. When you think about building a healthcare business, and I used to run a pharmacy, I used to run a brick and mortar clinic of primary care providers. So this is actually my first virtual care business, of like how a CEO might think about it that affects how you might think about it as a therapist joining a company. And so, and I want to stress, there are pluses and minuses to all different kinds of models. All of this is about, in my mind, finding what is the best fit for you. And so the first thing I'll flag is, I used to run brick and mortar. So I had the difference between working in a brick and mortar setting versus a digital setting. And so on the brick and mortar setting, it's probably the obvious, but there's a set location. There's typically set hours. It's all in-person care. And typically when you're running those sort of operations, it's really built around a clinic schedule. You figure out when you can stay open, what are the right hours, and then you try to make sure that your patients in the community knows when to come in, and that's how you orient. And so there's typically less flexibility for the clinicians because you're kind of operate around that common set of hours. But a lot of pluses and minuses on all of these. On the digital side, the advantage it often has is that it is remote work for folks where all three of us, I think, are working from home right now. And my kids are getting home from school, so you may hear them in the background. There's often schedule flexibility in doing it. The care is remote, so some people love doing remote care, and for some people they don't. But it also does mean that you need to be oriented as a business more around the patient's schedule. And so, as opposed to saying, look, this is when the clinic is open, you come in here. Now, instead, we're saying, listen, when do the patients most need us? And so some of the flexibility that you have on like the earlier bullet, you might have to trade off to say, if the patients we're most trying to serve, the best time from home for them to engage is between these hours, you have to orient yourself to make that work. So that's number one. The second is whether or not to be an employee or a contractor. And some of the benefits, for an employee, is you get benefits. There's typically more of an investment in training and career development, but there's typically lower flexibility. And I'll talk about that in 1 second. Versus on the contractor side, not always, but there's usually no or fewer benefits. You often have a lot of schedule flexibility. You can pick where to come in often for a lot of companies. And I think the main trade-off in this is, if you think about it from the kind of business side, is on the employee side, where you're saying we are going to pay a salary and all the benefits. And so we need to really make sure these clinicians, we can use them as effectively as possible to sort of kind of orient to where the patients need us. On the contractor side, since it's typically hourly and it can vary a little bit, it's often sort of the reverse. So the contractor, they have a lot of flexibility, but but they aren't necessarily guaranteed the full salary. And so you'll often find like, and for our world, because we're working with schools and when school hours are open, when kids need to, we have generally an employee model, is we need our team to be able to orient as much as we can to when those things are available in a way that we wouldn't do if we were a contractor, for example. And then the last one is, this is actually a big deal for those of you looking at digital health companies, is whether or not it's oriented towards all patients, including Medicaid and uninsured, versus a model that's focused more on families that have commercial insurance or pay out of pocket. And many of you may know, but typically the Medicaid rates is far lower. I mean, it can be as much lower as 50% in some state. And so what that means, I mean, literally for the same great care that you guys are providing, it's being paid half. And so what that means is that for it to be sustainable is you need to be able to see more patients. And on Hazel and other providers do this, we also see the uninsured. So we sort of eat all of that cost of not getting zero payment, but it does mean a trade-off on caseload. And so it is one of those things that you always want to think about, is the trade-off of those models versus each other. And anyways, I hope that, Jacqueline, I hope that's a little helpful of just like how to think about companies across these different dimensions. And Ebonie, I don't know if anything you would add on that.
No, nothing I would really add. I just, as you were going along, just sort of thinking about it, obviously, you know, with Hazel, I'm in a leadership role, but prior to being at this point in my career, I was working in the fields, quote unquote, and, you know, seeing clients myself, and just looking at these three categories as being very, very important in sort of making the determinations or the decisions you have to make, both from, you know, just your work-life balance, what it is that you need for your particular life, like the stability of income when you're looking at employee versus contractor. I think from a clinician perspective, those are the things that are also important to consider, right? So whereas from an organizational standpoint and leadership and then, you know, developing these programs, we have to consider these things. I think as clinicians, you also have to look at the different costs and variables that factor into all of these categories. Yeah.
And maybe one more thing I'll say, and you made me think of Ebonie, is and I'll use the Hazel as an example, but this is, I think, true for all companies. And so for Hazel, for example, since we in building something new in digital, we have to be really oriented about where our patients are, right? And for us, those are kids. And so in one state, we may have a school district that is excited to work with us, and they're really excited about having in-school hours, because let's just say in that district, they have capacity. They know that a lot of maybe their kids in the community might not be able to access from home, and they really want to use parts of the school day, which might be during lunch or during PE for kids that really have a need. And so all of a sudden in that state, there's one model of where the kids are most available. And then there may be another district in another state where they're not yet ready to do that. There's, for whatever reason, their schools in their district aren't ready, and they want to start the process at school, but they'd rather us see kids after school at home. And both of those are reasonable things for schools to have. And so, but on the front end, you can imagine now, gosh, what that might mean is that the therapist in one state, we might need to have a very different sort of schedule than a therapist in another state. And you recognize, and that's where I say some of the flexibility that's required on the digital space is because now, instead of saying, look, these are clinic hours, you really have to respond to where they are, which is easy to say, but it also means a lot of change and flexibility required. And that's, just being transparent. Those are things that are really important to think about, of knowing, because sometimes we don't even know until after we get going. That same school district that may have in the beginning, then they say, we only want after school hours. Now they say, you know what, now we actually like it. We'd really like to open school hours. And then we want to be responsive, but we know there's a lot of these incredible clinicians who often have kids and family now are saying, listen, can we work together to adjust things to now be where these kids are? And that's one of the realities of digital health. And I know we're going to talk about communications with you guys, but I think it's that lack. Sometimes it's, you don't plan enough ahead. And sometimes actually the reality of how much you have to change if you want to respond and do something that hasn't ever been quite done before.
Thank you for sharing that. And I will also add that when you talked about the fact that you all accept Medicaid and that you also eat the costs for people who do not have insurance, that is aligned with some people's moral compass and their vision and who the types of clients that they want to serve. And I think that that's also very important, is to make sure that if you want to take a chance on a company, then you want to really know, like, what's their mission? What do they value? And so I really appreciate you sharing that. Are we ready for Q&A?
Let's do it.
All right. So feel free to drop your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. I'll keep an eye out, but I have a few questions, so we'll get started. This is for both of you. How do you decide what information to pass on to your clinical leadership, Josh, but then also Ebonie as a clinical leader, then to your therapists and clinicians?
Yeah, great question, Jacqueline. And so I guess I'll start with, so I think, the clinical, I tend to not think of clinical leadership separate from kind of our leadership overall. There's our leaders who are clinicians. And I think it's really important that that be the case. And so with my leadership team, we call it the flight team, is a short name for it, but 3 of the folks who are on there are clinicians. And I think the expectation, I should also say, is like, of the non-clinicians, is that we need to understand that work as much as anything. And so I think for us, number one goal is to make sure that we need to make sure whatever decisions that we're making about the business that are made with, I always try to think that there's like 3 things that have to factor into every decision. Is like, one is like, there's the business reality. There's 2 is how aligned is it with our mission, our clinical mission. And then 3rd, there's an element of like our people and culture and team. And so all of those things going to have to factor into the decision-making process. All to say, we don't do that perfectly. Like, there's plenty of stuff that I think that we can do far better, especially as we grow quickly. And so I think, for us, we need to find better, companies like us have to find better and better ways to make sure that we've got both a good way to share information down, but then also a good way to get information back up on how things are actually working for our team. And so we have different structures of meeting structures that we create to do it. But I honestly think sometimes the best way to do things is the more informal ways of joining a huddle or getting feedback from the team. And Ebonie, what would you share?
So as far as sharing information with our clinicians, I think in deciding what information needs to be passed on, I think that there has to be a consideration for obviously the relevance of the information, but we know, like, our clinicians, like, that they're like the heart of our organization, right? So they're already doing super tough work and have a lot of things on their plate. And so I think it's important, sort of from a servant leadership perspective, to really be just be the headwinds and kind of like use yourself to sort of filter out what is necessary to share with the clinicians. But I do think that going forth and, having a attitude of trust and of sort of inclusion to bring everybody in, it's important, I think, for most people when they're doing their job, that they understand the job that they're doing, but also the impact of what they're doing and how the decisions that we as leadership are making impact those things. How do they impact our, those that we serve? Sort of just a little bit more of the bigger picture. And so I think all of those are the factors that you have to consider when you decide, like, what information filters all the way through or what information isn't that relevant to be shared.
Thank you. How do you balance being transparent with your team while limiting FOMO or over communication that could lead to fear, which clinicians, we get a little antsy. So excited to hear these answers.
Yeah, and I'll start for then, but Ebonie, I also think this is just having led 3 different companies, like this is like one of the biggest challenges, because there's like on the dimension of inclusion and transparency, I personally like to share more, but I've realized that there's times where that is good and there's times where that is not good. I think we're about to do our annual year-end meeting where we do a bunch of things, and every time we do those, we do a survey afterwards. And one of the questions we'll ask is, it like too long or too short? Do we share enough or do we not share enough? And every single time, every company I've ever run, there are people that answer on both sides. So every single meeting there'll be people like, wow, that was way too long. You shared too much. And then there's another group of people that say, gosh, I wanted way more detail. And I share that, and again, not surprised to all of you, given the work you do, is like everyone has such different individual needs for information. and wants, and that is okay. And I think that's the thing is trying to balance, because I think for us, sometimes there's a question of like, when, let's say there's a change coming down the pipeline that you think may be happening, but you're not yet sure. Do you how soon do you announce that when it's still not fully fleshed out? And because there are a group of people that would far rather know as soon as you're thinking about the idea, and they can be completely okay not knowing how it's going to work, to know that they'd rather know sooner. And there are other folks who, if you've shared that, but I think we're going to do this, but I can't tell you yet what it means to you, it causes stress and anxiety. And so it is a bit of a balance I will say, I probably don't do this as well as I always want to, of like how to give enough clarity of where we're going. I like sometimes do the analogy of like, because we when you're in a business like ours, you're really managing by like compass than really a map, because you're not entirely sure how you're going to get there and how to make sure that everyone knows like this is north. Here's where I think north is, with enough clarity that people know we're on the right track, but try to not get folks too caught up with some of the details that aren't flushed out yet, because we can't yet tell you exactly how we're going to get to that point. And so it's a balancing act. And Ebonie, what do you think?
No, I totally agree with that. I think that information is necessary to build and sort of generate buy-in, and it's important for everyone from left to right, all across the organization, to really believe in the mission, believe in how we're carrying it out, believe in, what we're doing, and learn. I think of sort of myself and the opportunities that I've been afforded even prior to Hazel, to be in the room and to understand, why certain decisions were being made and how it tied back. That was how I learned a lot about how Medicaid actually works, because someone was willing to explain it to us and explain, okay, like your document, you have to have measurable information in your documentation, and here's why, because this is a requirement. And, for me, I think as a clinician, that really took a lot of the frustration sometimes out of it, because I understood why this was important and how it related back. And it didn't just seem like a task list of just more and more things to do, or more and more ways to do what I felt like I knew how to do better or whatever. It was really tied to reason and moving us forward and mission and value. And that was super important, and in a way helped me develop as a clinician, but also helped me like gain knowledge and information that's really empowered me and helped me to move into a space where I could also be a leader, and have, a broader information. Like, obviously went to school, I know all of the therapy things, but I wanted to know more about some of the other pieces of how do you run an organization, or how can I contribute or utilize my license differently. Even I think cross-state licensing might be a good example. Like, you might not dive deep into all the nitty-gritty details of what's going on in each state, but your clinicians might need to know, like, okay, cross-state licensing is valuable here because it allows us to be more nimble, more flexible, right? So I agree with Josh. There's definitely a point where information is too much, but I do think that leaders being willing to share information really also helps to develop that next generation of leaders and clinicians who have the skills and the acumen to understand business, which helps them be better clinicians and hopefully better future leaders too.
Yeah, and I will say, and Ebonie's like, I love questions as you think about out there, and it even though I've worked in different parts of healthcare, it can sometimes, when you're so much in the day-to-day, you can sometimes forget when there's something you're doing to not explain the why. And what I found, especially with clinicians, is, and a lot of clinicians I've worked with over the years, I might be the first time they've ever worked with a for-profit CEO, and there is natural suspicion sometimes, and that is okay. But I often find that if I don't do a good enough job, sometimes here's the thing we're doing, and then there's a question of, if we don't explain why, that all the sorts of stories you create behind. And so I love when people, even the tough questions, when people ask those of like, why are we doing that? And because it forces the leadership to say, this is, like, you didn't understand like why we have to do X for Medicaid, as Ebonie said, this is why we do it. Or, I know someone in the chat has a question about the uninsured, of like, gosh, there's some things that we have to do more efficiently than another company, because there's a bunch of things that we know we're not going to get reimbursed for. So that's part of why we have to do this part better than another company. And you should always, ask your leaders why as much as you need to.
So what it sounds like is that transparency builds trust, which is oftentimes what we have to do in sessions with our clients.
Absolutely.
So Really, really appreciate those answers. What do you wish you would have communicated better to your clinical leadership team and clinicians early on in Hazel's growth?
Yeah, I think, there's a whole bunch of stuff, Jacqueline, but I think that one of the biggest things I wish we had communicated is like, what are when you're building something new, what are the things you know for sure? And what are the things that you believe, but you haven't proven yet? And I think like this is the example I gave earlier about different districts having different needs and requirements and what that might look like, because I think there's, anytime you're doing something new, there's so many things that can change. There's some things you feel very confident about, and there's some things you have less confidence about. And as we've brought on more and more clinicians, we may have been their very first time ever working for a digital health company to try to bend, it wasn't from lack of transparency, but probably lack of, we could have done a better job, I think, of saying, here's what we know, and here's some things that we believe but may change, so that folks coming in would sort of know from the get-go that better. And as much as I said that stuff about explaining the why, like I'm sure there's there's a number of things that we can better explain, particularly the kind of the business side of how things operate, so that folks know how we work. What do you think, Ebonie?
I agree. I wasn't around in the early early days of Hazel, but I agree. I think that is always helpful. And I have been a part of another startup, and so I would echo that same sentiment. There are definitely things that you kind of have a hypothesis about, you're not exactly sure, and it's really good like early on to make sure that your team knows like where those things lie, so that again, that buy-in, everybody understands that things are going to morph and we're on the same page. But I do believe that you're on the right page with that response. I agree for sure.
All right. So now it's kind of a tough question, but which you kind of have explained thoroughly, but how do you make sure there's clinical input in all business decisions? A lot of our community, we've been burned by a lot of organizations who have failed to listen to clinical input. And so we just love to hear from leaders who value that. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I will say that, and we do a lot, and we always need to do better. So I want to stress that it is. I think for us that there's, again, I think two parts of like, one, making sure that we've got great leaders like Ebonie and the rest of the team that can really come in and both convey the voice of their team, but also be kind of peers and be able to push on other folks of the business. Because I think there's a difference between having a clinician who's wearing that hat in the room versus someone who has an equal seat at the table, and making sure that we can do, which also does mean that that it also means that we, like when I think about having an equal seat at the table, it means that we need to make sure that our chief health officer is phenomenal, Dr. Gales, he's phenomenal. We are the first for-profit company he's ever worked for too. So some element is, how do we make sure that Dr. Gales like understands some of the things on the business side they may have had access to, but equally important is all the non-clinicians. It's incumbent on those folks to learn the clinical side too as best we can. And so it doesn't mean that that folks could be therapists or providers, but they need to have an equal level of understanding of that. And so, and I will say the other thing I've learned too is I just in the last couple of weeks did a bunch of shadowing of our physical health providers, those clinicians, and sitting in on visits. And that was such a good experience, because even though I've been here for years, I know that so many things change and we have new clinicians, and staying grounded in that is so important. And it's probably been a year since I've done that. So this is more shame on me for not doing it more often, but it was a good reminder of how everyone needs, at the core of what we do is delivering care. And if we don't really all understand what that means, then nothing else really matters.
Anything to add, Ebonie?
Oh, yeah, I just was going to say, I think I'm a really great example of this in a sense, as Josh highlighted. And this question really taps into, my why clinical leadership has been important to me, working in the past with organizations who, the leadership team, the C-suite, it was just full of business people who were great individuals. However, there was definitely a limitation to the clinical voice in all different areas of the decisions that were being made about delivering care, right? And we are the ones delivering the care. So it always just dawned on me like, there's, kind of a disconnect. And so I love, specifically at Hazel and at some of the other organizations that I've been with, really just infusing the all sides of the organization with clinical people who have a clinical background, who have that clinical experience, so that those points of view can be considered, right? And to Josh's point, right, having a seat at that table, super important, because as we know, you go and look at all different sides of the business. Some things that are really great for business might feel kind of icky, like from a clinical perspective. There has to be someone who's able to flag that, and then everyone come together and make a very intentional decision about how that's going to be addressed, or what, different things we need to do in order to make sure that we're not putting the quality of the care that we're providing in jeopardy because it looks like a really good business decision. And that can happen so easily. So I really love that. I think that's super important. And I'm appreciative of the opportunity to be in that place, right? To again be the voice of a clinician, of a therapist who does and has done the work, and have that vantage point of how that the business side and the clinical side impact each other.
Great answers. Okay, the next question, I'm going to kind of blend both of these. Would love to get your perspective, Ebonie, on how can a therapist stand out in a stack of applications? And then also, how are you all hiring in this market? Would love to answer both of those together.
Oh yeah, this market. So how can a clinician stand out? I've done so much hiring in my experience. And honestly, I would say that, I love to see resumes that reflect impact. Not just, I can write a treatment plan, which is great that you can write a treatment plan because that's important. So yes, like the task-based element of it is super important, but what is the impact of your work over time, and really sort of shifting the way I think as clinicians that we think about what we're doing when we are helping individuals, right? So we're helping individuals. So how do we really quantify that? How do you really make that reflect on your resume? Like, what does that look like? As opposed to, we know what the therapeutic process is, right? Like all of us know that. And every resume says, so I did a treatment plan and I diagnosed. So yeah, we get that. But I think that finding a way to really quantify the impact that you feel like you've made at your current or past organizations is a really good way to kind of set yourself apart a little bit as far as a resume is concerned. Before I talk about the second part, Josh, did you want to have to add anything on that one?
Yeah, that was perfect.
Okay. And so the second part, how are we hiring in this market? Great question. We're in Hazel because of the way that our business is structured and our organization, the target market for our organization, the need, regardless of the market, is still there. And so we're working super, super hard, our recruiting teams, our people teams, all of the teams, to still, have boots on the ground and make sure that we are getting into places where therapists are. And again, myself as a clinical leader, using myself to understand my network and understand like, what is it that clinicians want? What is it that clinicians need? I'm very big believer that, when you're partnered or when you're in a relationship with the organization, it needs to be mutually beneficial. So as an organization, understanding what that mutual benefit is and making sure that a part of our value proposition to those who are going to partner with us from in an employment perspective is there, and that we're carrying those things out, and that we're able to adjust what we're doing from, like our employment practices and, what we offer in our packages, benefit packages, and like what the job looks like, really tailor it as best as we can to actually meet the constantly changing needs of clinicians in the market. Josh.
Yeah, Ebonie, you said it far better than I could. So that was well said.
All right. Well, let's talk about how do we determine salary and what factors do you consider when you're offering a person a job at Hazel?
Well, I will start maybe at a high level and I'll turn it to you. And I think honestly that this, like if you take a moment like this, some of the stuff I talked about before, kind of connects to like, how do you think about the business, right? Which is that we are like for a business, our model is built around serving all patients. So we're sort of like factoring like all the care that we do on both the mental health and the physical health side and how our business works. Like, what does the reimbursement rate look like to sort of do that type of work? Because that decides a little bit of like just how much resources the company has to do things. And then, so that's like the top down way of like, what are your resources? And then I'd say bottom up at the clinical level is really understanding like, what's the actual market rate? Like, how do we find great clinicians paying a competitive salary of something that feels really fair, and to try to make sure that we can find a way to match those two things together, which might mean that for us, there may be folks who have only been in private practice taking private insurance or cash pay that might not be the right fit for how the model works. But that's how kind of we approach it overall today at a high level. And Ebonie, I know there's a lot more like detail of like state by state and all those sorts of fun things.
And so I think just to kind of give a little bit of an overview of the rest of the other piece of it. So yeah, so that's what we look at from the high level. And then when it really gets down to it and we're actually putting out offers and determining what those offers are going to look like, we have to look at, again, just the way that our model is built and what values in clinicians are going to really impact the work that we're doing. So, diversity is important. We are nationwide. So you have, state licensure. Myself, I'm licensed in multiple states. And this was one of the reasons why, right? So the ability to be more nimble, more flexible in where I can see clients, where I can see kiddos. And so those are some of the things that we consider. So like cross-state licensure, language is super important because, we're in schools all over. And so there is a diverse population of students represented, and we want to be able to meet as many students' needs as possible. So those are definitely some of the other factors that we consider when determining like where within the range a clinician might fall for an offer.
Yeah, and like philosophically, it should be that wherever you think over, it should be the same across all roles. Like when you think about like in terms of like you shouldn't, you want to work a place that if you sort of see like relative to competitive landscape of how do you think about reimbursing like engineers, incredibly important, versus your clinicians versus the folk. We have a lot of folks who work for Hazel who are not clinicians, who are out in the field working with schools. And so it should feel consistent across your sort of like your people philosophies and approaches across all of those different dimensions. And so, and a lot of the things that when we look for those non-clinical roles, we're trying to also make sure that they have a similar passion around the mission, the why that Ebonie described for the non-clinical roles.
That's great. All right, last question, and then we'll hop to our questions that we have in Q&A. How has Hazel handled the potential for growth beyond where you already are?
Yeah, this is and for Ebonie is that so here's the exciting news for us is like there is a lot of the work we're doing in schools. There's a ton of growth, and so we're we didn't want to make this a big Hazel presentation, but we're now in, I think, across 12 states. And I think this is one of the questions I saw in the chat. There's roughly 3 million kids in our partner district. So like everything from Atlanta public schools to the state of Hawaii that we're now working with, to Houston, which we recently signed, which is where you're new, Jacqueline. And so the kind of the, and I'm sure a lot of you are seeing this, that like the good news and the tough news is there's so much need for kids in this country, and a lot of, and schools are such a great place to go provide and connect with families. There's already transportation, there's already trust. And so we really, that model, we're growing very fast. I think that the challenge is how do you make sure you can grow something, but do it thoughtfully and do it well. And, for folks like Ebonie and our other leaders is some of these districts we talked are so big. How do you plan for growth when you're literally growing at, you might double in size every year? It's exciting, but it's also really, really hard because you want to make sure you're getting the right folks and you can train folks and develop, which is just, it makes the job of leaders, a lot harder than when you're growing at a smaller rate. And
anything to add, Ebonie? Okay. All right, so let's hop to our Q&A. Michelle asked, What is the split between physical health and behavioral health that you see in a typical school district or customer? Is there collaboration between the providers within Hazel? That's a great question.
It is, and I'll start. And I'll give like the physical health side, Ebony, and then you can give maybe the mental health side. And so it actually varies a lot depending a little bit on school districts, like both like what part of the state, but also sometimes like a rural school district might look really different than when an urban school district starts with needs. And so I'd say it's probably like on a given day we do more physical health visits than mental health visits, but I think most of the growth we're getting is a lot on the mental health side because of need. But we actually started originally with only physical health back in when we started this in 2016-ish. But what we found actually a lot of the focus in the early days were kids were missing way too much school. There's this term in the school world called chronic absenteeism, which are kids that are missing a lot of school, which has huge impact on every kind of metric you think about for kids' well-being. And what we found is a lot of the kids were coming to our clinic. Some of them it was because they had untreated asthma or everything else you can think about for kids like pink eye and lice and all those things. But a lot of kids we were coming in with perpetual headaches and stomach aches. And we were finding a lot of our doctors were finding that they weren't faking, those were real symptoms, but it wasn't an underlying medical reason that was driving it. It wasn't it wasn't a GI issue. And so we were finding that a lot of times it was underlying mental health issue that was driving that symptom and behavior. And we didn't have, even though there's these great local providers, there wasn't enough capacity to refer them to. And so that's why we started to build this. But our physical health providers love this because now there's a way for kids that actually come in through that mechanism to now make a referral over to our mental health team and then connect them into a provider. And Ebony, what would you say from the mental health side?
As far as collaboration, I think that a lot, sorry if you hear my people, I'm in Florida, so they're getting ready to go to bed. So from the mental health side, I think that it's similar, so we see obviously lots of kiddos who have a lot of different things going on. And so this just the way that our model is structured, it also allows us a really good mechanism to get those kiddos in for medical care. If they have, some sort of need that we can't really, it's not really being addressed through the mental health care that we're being able to provide. Obviously, we know that in person, so wherever the child might be, there might not be something, where we can urgently connect them to a medical provider, depending on just the availability of those of medical resources. And so just having this partnership is really good. I think that it's just a really good, partnership is the best word that I would use to sort of be able to take a whole child approach and make sure that we're not just addressing, one thing. And if we kind of have an inkling that something might be going on, we have our physical health providers that can assist. I was recently in Texas and had the opportunity to tour school and meet with one of the nurses who sort of serves as who kind of helps with some of the medical visits that we have at that school. And it was just so amazing to see, her value of being able to have both, right? Being able to have both and to being able to feel confident that, okay, if this isn't, working, we still have the other side of the house, the mental health or the physical health, where we can, in one place, without too much fuss, be able to refer this child back or forth in order to get them what they need, which ultimately is the goal.
Integrated approach, but also interdisciplinary. I mean, that's the only way that we can continue to provide care. Right, it's our next question from Rachel. Excellent presentation, Josh and Ebony. Since there is such a shortage of therapists in our country, I'm curious to hear some of the challenges you experience when recruiting clinicians. What tactics have you found most helpful in finding great clinicians?
Ebony, you want to take that one?
Yeah, so the first part of it, the challenges, the challenges are vast. There's a lot of different challenges because there just aren't enough of us. There just simply are not, right? So the demand is always going to be greater than those of us who are available to meet the need. And so I think in my mention earlier, I believe that values are super important. And just as a clinician, and in my experience overseeing clinicians, managing, leading, directing clinicians, partnering with clinicians, I understand that most of us are It's important to us to be somewhere where we feel like whatever our personal values are, whatever our professional values are, about the service that we're providing or the care that we're providing, it's important for Hazel to position itself as a vehicle to help those who we're partnering with an employment perspective in order to meet that need, right? So for me, it really looks like a mutually beneficial relationship. And I think that that's where we are doing a really great job in terms of being able to find clinicians who are a great match for Hazel, because just the importance of our mission for us, as well as for those who we're bringing into the organization, really allows there to be a real good alignment and a gel that I think helps us kind of continue to move the needle forward.
Great answer. All right. Last question. And then we have a comment. So how many states are you practicing in? And I think Josh mentioned 12. And how do you determine how many non-paying patients you can help?
Yeah, good question. So the way that we built our model is to say like there's not a limit. So we sort of said, how do we, and what the way we operate is we have a combination of some school funding, and it's sort of schools that need more support and resources there. And then also where we can, we build health plans. So we're trying to bring like these two groups, like the education system, the healthcare system, they're both trying to solve this and kind of bring it together. And so we've sort of made the model work that whatever school we operate, whatever that sort of like insurance profile is, that we would serve all the kids. And so there's no like, and that's sort of like it, core to our mission. And so in the same district, we might have a school that have, depending especially on the state, Jack, where you live, a lot of people don't realize the uninsured rate in Texas for kids is about, I think it's 17-18%, and it's really high. There's plenty of things that aren't great about my state of California, but I think it's about 1% here. But we have to make our model though has to work that in both those places and those schools that we can take core to us is to serve all kids in that school. And so that's a little bit of the kind of thing that we're trying to build and navigate around. But thankfully, the schools and the health plans have come together to make that model possible.
I have a question about that. Do you all help parents complete applications for the Medicaid plan, like in their area?
Yeah, we don't. And so there's a whole, and I think you guys, a lot of know the term around social determinants of health. And so what we have found on the physical health side, since we started, we'd often find kids with stomach aches where it was really a food insecurity, right? And that's, and so how do we support there? I know, a lot of the things that you guys see on the mental health side, maybe all sorts of other social determinants related issues around housing. And so for these things, we've got a case management function. We call them our family resource managers that try to connect into those local resources. And so like for insurance, for example, we don't really, we're best positioned to actually help with the enrollment process, but to help that family connect to a resource that might know how to get there. And that's, I think, one of the challenges for a lot of families is there are tons of resources in the communities, but they often don't know where to go to get those. And so the role we try to play, and schools try to do this a lot, it is often hard because parents are often at work. And so if we can play a role, especially in the evening, especially in that parent's native language, to help connect them to a resource, it's a big role we can play, but we're always trying to figure out exactly how much, where we connect and where we actually facilitate.
That's a great resource. I'm glad you all have that. Last comment, Michelle said, most peds, I'm thinking she means like pediatricians, do not understand the somatic piece, which I completely agree. So very happy that you all are doing both things at the same time.
Yeah, and I will just say, like, I'm having worked with physicians for many years. They're like, historically, this is changing, but they typically weren't trained in this, right? And so it is like the training that they've gone through, and we have phenomenal providers, physicians, nurse practitioners, physician assistants. But for a lot of them, they love having Ebonie's team here because they know there's a need, but it often wasn't something they were trained on. And similarly on the other side, I mean, there may be a child who maybe has anxiety, but also has eczema. And even though you might be addressing the anxiety, that doesn't change the fact that child has eczema that may come up. And so how do we make sure that, like that example, you can get that child a prescription to get cared for? Because that you still need to deal with that underlying symptom. And so I think we're excited and very early, but this idea of bringing these two disciplines together to really have, we call it our whole child approach, which I know, for many of you, that's the world you've been operating in for many years.
Okay, this has been really good. We don't have any more questions. I want to thank both of you for taking time out of your evenings to talk to our community about this very important topic. Any last thoughts, any last statements?
I'll just say thank you guys. It is like one of the great joys of the work that I get to do is we get to hear the success stories from families or from school districts. And it's hard because there's so much, and you guys see on the press, there's so much press around all of the pains happening in our country right now, particularly around kids, and it's real and it's happening in all of our communities. But there is also so many great things that are happening of the care you provide. And I'm assuming you guys hear it in your own, but we get to hear the parents talk about it and other folks of what happens when you get an amazing therapist to help their kids. And I mean, it's not hyperbole to say it's life-changing for so many people. And so, even though I will be likely, not many people won't ever work with Hazel, just we appreciate all the work you do for whether it's kids, adults, or seniors. Thank you.
Absolutely. Definitely echoing Josh's statements, just really grateful for the opportunity to share this evening. I had the opportunity to kind of put on my clinician hat a little bit more today than I normally do on a day-to-day. And I think that that's so valuable. As I said, my own why is really tied to some of the things that I experienced when I was working in the field, trying to navigate it and not really having as much guidance as I would have liked or opportunities to learn. And so just having that chance to kind of share and just highlight these things, I hope it really landed where it needed to land for those who are looking for that information and those opportunities. And so I'm just grateful to be able to be a vehicle to kind of share that information and just have the opportunity to hang out with y'all this evening.
Oh, yeah, mute Jacqueline.
Mute.
Fine. Well, we really appreciate that. Thank you both so much. And everyone have a good evening.